Hello and welcome. I'm glad that you're here with us again as we continue our chronological read through of the Bible. Today's reading mixes a number of different things together. It begins it with the description of the seven lampstands that were to be set up in the tabernacle. Now, functionally, those lampstands provided the light in what would otherwise be a rather dark environment. After all, that tent there would be no daylight in there. But even more, those lamps stood before the most holy place, and they reminded us, they taught us that the only true light comes from God. Even as they give their light, it reminds us where the true light comes from. The balance of chapter 8 deals with the dedication of the Levites into their service of the Lord, and eventually with their retirement as well. So their dedication went this way. First, they were made clean. You'll read about that as you go in there, what was involved in that. Then there's a sin offering and a burnt offering that's made on their behalf. Now, this is all of the Levites, all of the Levite males. The hands of the people are then laid on the Levites. The hands of all of the people are laid on the Levites, marking them as their substitutes. And there is a wave offering. The Levites are then made a wave offering before the Lord. Now, they're not sacrificed on the altar. As a wave offering, they're not consumed by the fire, but they're waved back and forth before the Lord as they're presented for service to Him. Exactly how they did this, I guess I'm not really sure, but your imagination can probably give you a number of ways, all of which could be feasible. If you recall, God had set the Levites aside for service to Him in His temple some time ago. So now that is affirmed by everyone, and they are dedicated to that service. Because much of the work that the Levites did involved heavy lifting, after all, they're moving all of the parts of the tabernacle and the curtain that goes around, actually the fence, I guess you would call it, that goes around and so on. That's heavy work. It's heavy lifting. So they served from the ages of 25 to 50, and then they retired to keep guard. Anyone that was over 50 would keep guard over those who were doing the heavy lifting. So they still participated, but they didn't actually participate in the carrying and so on. God's actually very, very clear in His instructions for the Levites and what they are to do. So there's really no excuse for disobeying them. In chapter 9, God gives His command to the Israelites that they observe the Passover, that they observe it as a reminder of what God has done for them. Remember, God had redeemed them from Egypt through the death of the firstborn in all of Egypt, and He had redeemed their firstborn through the blood of the lamb that was painted on their doorposts. All of that according to God's command. This, of course, points to the sacrifice of the ultimate Passover lamb, Jesus Christ, through whose blood we are redeemed and cleansed from sin. But what happens if you can't participate in the holy things at the time of the Passover because you're unclean? What are you supposed to do then? Well, the Passover is very, very important, and God's command that it be celebrated by all is very urgent. So a case was brought before Moses regarding how to deal with some people who were unclean because they had had to touch a dead body, and they were not yet clean after that. So notice that Moses doesn't just immediately answer on his own. What does he do? He goes to God. He says, sit tight for a minute. Let me talk to God, find out what God has to say about this. And God then provides His instructions for how that's to happen. God's answer is really quite simple. It emphasizes the importance of celebrating the Passover if you are at all able, and it provides a second chance to celebrate the Passover a month later for those who were unable at the time to. No other rules change. Everything else stands. I think the lesson that we have from Moses here about consulting God for instruction in an area that we're not sure of is a lesson well taken, something we would be wise to practice today as well. So now everything is ready for Israel to strike out to their destination. As before, God's going to lead His people in a pillar of fire by night, pillar of cloud by day, and their instructions are simple. When the cloud lifts from the tabernacle, it's time to move out. Whenever the cloud settles down, it's time to, or wherever the cloud settles down, it's time to camp. So at God's command, they camped. At God's command, they moved on. Everything is dependent on God's will. They would begin their day, probably poke their head out the tent and take a look and see whether or not the cloud was there. What did God have in store for them? Whether they were going to travel or not. What it would be good for us actually to be so diligent in our checking of what it is that God would have us to do as well in our lives of service to Him. Take an example from the Israelites there. The beginning of chapter 10 introduces us to the trumpets that will be used to signal Israel. The sound of 2 trumpets means that everyone's to gather together for a meeting. The sound of 1 trumpet summoned the 70 elders together for a meeting. When the cloud indicated that they were to move on from their present location, the trumpets would sound to command the departure of the 4 groups. So the trumpets would sound, the first group would go. Sometime later, trumpets would sound again, the second group would go, and so on. That way there wouldn't be such mass confusion in their journey. Notice also that those who carried the components of the tabernacle traveled first so that they could have everything ready and set up. When they came to the end of the journey, they'd set everything back up again so that when the furnishings arrived, all the rest of the stuff arrived, they would be able to place it immediately where it belonged. Once Israel arrived in the promised land, the trumpets would then be used to signal that they were going to war and to signal the festivals. The trumpets served as a reminder that it was God who was calling them, and it is God who is guiding them. You know what? When Jesus returns, we're told that He will announce it with the sound of trumpets, and all, whether dead or alive, will be called to meet Him by the sounds of those trumpets, just as Israel was. And now, at the end of our reading for today, finally, Israel sets out on her journey. As always, I pray that you're learning and growing as you continue to read these scriptures. I look forward to meeting with you again tomorrow as we continue our journey. May God be with you and bless you.